Thank you so much for coming. My name is Lamont Adu. I'm a professor of Romance Studies, and I am the co-director and co-founder of the From Slavery to Freedom Lab, along with my colleague, Jasmine Nicole Cobb and Richard Powell. And on behalf of all of us, we'd like to welcome you to our third and final masterclass of the semester. It is going to be a real treat today, and we are so excited to have a pioneer there isn't a field that he hasn't revolutionized, but we are really excited to have a pioneer here with us today. This is a more informal format. The idea behind the masterclass is it's for us to kind of come together in conversation and community, learn, talk, and just exchange. I just want to really just say a quick thank you to, come here, Barbara. Barbara, just please give a round of applause for Barbara. Barbara has been the machine behind this whole masterclass. You have gotten her emails. She has gone above and beyond to really make this masterclass possible. She is, I can't believe she's only a first year graduate student, but somebody needs to give her a tenure job. But Barbara has really helped us to make this whole thing possible. So I would like to acknowledge her and to thank her for all of her hard work and efforts, and please give her a round of applause. And without further ado, I would like to pass it along to my lovely colleague, Dr. Jasmine Nicole Cobb, who will introduce our master today.
Thank you. My friend and mentor, Dean of the School of Communication at Northwestern, and Annenberg University Professor of Performance Studies and African American Studies at Northwestern. E. Patrick Johnson has published widely in the areas of race, class, gender, sexuality, and performance. He is the founder and director of the Black Arts Initiative at Northwestern. He is also project and artist and nonprofit arts organization engaged in art for social change and impact. Johnson is a prolific performer and scholar and an inspiring teacher whose research in artistry has greatly impacted African American studies, performance studies, and sexuality studies. You all already know his books, Appropriating Blackness, Performance and the Politics of Authenticity, Sweet Tea, Black Gay Men of the South, and Oral History. He is the editor of Cultural Struggles, Performance Ethnography, Praxis, by Dwight Conquergood, of Black Queer Studies, a critical anthology, as well as the forthcoming Black Tino Queer Performance. He is currently at work on a companion text for Sweet Tea entitled Honey Pot. This is out. Yes. Honey Pot, Southern Black Women Who Love Black Women, as well as numerous other writings on Black queer studies. This doesn't mention the film, which is beautiful, and the many mentorship hats Dean Johnson wears in addition to his scholarly hats. So without further ado, Dean E. Patrick Johnson.
Thank you. It is so wonderful to be here. Again, I was last here in February of 22. At the invitation of a former colleague and dear friend, Jennifer Nash. And it's always great to come back to home to North Carolina, because this is where I'm from, even though I'm in rival territory. I'm a Tar Heel, but it's friendly. We're frenemies. It's also wonderful to be here at this particular moment. As you know, in state legislatures around the country, Black queer studies, feminist studies, gender studies, anything that has studies on the end of it is being attacked. And I had the pleasure of being on the list of the folks canceled in Florida in January. And it was an interesting moment because I didn't even know I had been named as one of the folks banned from Florida. And then, my email started blowing up and so on and so forth. And one of the things that happened is I was mentioned in the New York Times as one of those scholars whose work has been banned in Florida. And a number of media folks reached out to me, whatever. And so I did actually I did 5 media things, but the one that got the most traction was an appearance on Democracy Now! And it wasn't, people don't believe me, but it wasn't a planned line. The commentator had asked me something about the governor, whose name I don't call his name, but I basically said, in response to the question about, the governor has said that your work and others lacks educational value. And my response was, the only thing that lacks educational value is the governor. So that line sort of went viral, as it were. But then I stopped responding to media requests because I didn't want to keep fueling the flames, because that's what he wants. What is more productive to me is what we're going to talk about today. And that is why this work is so important, and to trace the history of how something that is now codified as a subfield of Black studies started, how it began, and why it's so important to the history of Black people. So I'll say this. I'm going to sort of plot out in broad strokes some of the moments in African American history that are sort of epochs in the germination of Black queer studies. But I want to say from the outset that it's not a linear history. It's more Sankofa, looking back to look forward. And I'll also say that this is I'm going to just scratch the surface, that there's no way, in the time that we have, that we can cover all the twists and turns of this subfield, the things that lead up to this subfield. I'm hoping that we can have a great, robust conversation at the end as well to engage you. I'm not going to lecture as much as provide a little slideshow of and prompts and talking points. And there'll be not a performance from me, but a performance from someone else on the screen. So we'll get started. I want to say from the outset that feminist discourse and activism is germane to the formation of what is now Black queer studies. There could not be a Black queer studies without Black feminist studies. And I also say that the theory that feminist discourse and activism precede the theory. So people were doing feminist activism, queer activism. Folks were speaking in what we now think of as feminist discourse, but there wasn't really a theory around it in the academic sense of how we think of theory now. The other thing that I think is really important, that gender as a category of analysis preceded sexuality as a category of analysis, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But I want to start here with Sojourner Truth and the Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851. We often think about feminism in waves, first wave feminism, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. I don't know what we're in now, fourth, fifth. But Sojourner Truth and this Ohio Women's Rights Convention in 1851 would definitely be considered a part of the first wave of what we think of as feminism. As you can imagine, it was mostly white women. But Sojourner Truth was the interventionist, as only she could be. And it was her speech, now known as the Ain't I a Woman speech, at that convention, that contested the history that the white women were suggesting was the history of feminist struggle. The other interesting side note is that Sojourner Truth, it's debatable whether she actually used Ain't I a Woman in that speech. But now everybody thinks she did, so we're going to say she did. But it's debatable as to whether she actually used that language. But this is an important moment in the formation of Black feminist discourse. And that line in particular, whether she said it or not, it's attributed to her because it also speaks to Black women's humanity. And I'll stop here to sort of, as I will throughout my conversation today, to soapbox a little. You know, some of the discourse today from some of these legislators, some of whom have not sat in a classroom, suggests that one of the reasons why they're against DEI initiatives, why they're against teaching certain topics, is that there's no room left for debate, that the classrooms should be a space, higher ed should be a space of debate from all voices and so on and so forth. And on the surface, I agree with that position until it comes to debating my humanity. That's a line that you don't cross. For me, making the statement slavery was evil, that's not up for debate. So I just want to say that. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong one. 1892 is another pivotal moment in Black feminist discourse with the publication of Anna J. Cooper's book, A Voice from the South. Now, this book is thought to be the first articulation of Black feminism. I'll also say it's really important, because based on my own research, is that it's about the South. People sort of, as you all know, discount the South in so many different ways. When they talk about activism, it's always East Coast or about people being more progressive in the North. But folks were doing grassroots organizing on the ground in the South in a lot of spaces, in particular around Black feminist or Black women's activism. But Anna J. Cooper's book, A Voice from the South, is another pivotal moment. And it argued that the education of Black women will be the salvation of the race. Now we're going to see something similar to that, the Combahee River Collective is going to make a similar statement later, many years later, almost 100 years later, but you can see it's here. It starts here with Anna J. Cooper. The National Association of Colored Women was founded in 1896 to speak to the needs of Black women, and Mary Church Terrell was the founding president, and it was also led by Mary McLeod Bethune from 1917 to 1925, and many of you know there's a Mary McLeod Bethune has a university in her name, Bethune-Cookman College, which is still open today in Florida. God help them. Can y'all imagine being in the midst? At any rate, this organization, National Association of Colored Women, was instrumental in being a counter to some of the white women's organizations that did not allow black women's participation. They were also instrumental in the suffragist movement as well. I'm going to talk more about that in just a second. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's book, Righteous Discontent, The Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920, is a really important book when we talk about the emergence of respectability politics. Now, that phrase is common now, black respectability politics, blah, 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 blah. But no one understand, or many people don't understand where that language came from. But it's theorized by Higginbotham in her study in this book on black women in the black church, who adopted Victorian composure and styles of dress and ways of being in the world to instantiate their dignity. However, because of that, there was a disavowal of things that fell outside that kind of Victorian culture. Things like homosexuality, things like associated with the working class, and so on and so forth. And Higginbotham sort of traces how the formation of these black respectability politics emerged, particularly for black women, and how it led to a kind of self-policing of behavior. But what the important thing is that she provides a historical context for why black women moved in that direction. Because if you remember, post-emancipation, black people were depicted as, everything from pickaninnies to Jim Crow to Jezebels and so on and so forth. So to counter that kind of imagery, there was a reversion to being proper and so on and so forth. But again, we have this legacy of black respectability politics with us today. In the 1980s, we saw that be manifest through a show like The Cosby Show. Isn't that ironic? Anyway, we'll keep on moving. Y'all know I can't do this without throwing a little shade here and there. The suffragist movement, which the Colored Women's Voters League, this was the focus of the Colored Women's Voter League, because white women suffragists did not include black women, so they formed their own organizations. What's interesting is that many of these suffragist movements from white women were tethered to abolitionist movements. So it's interesting that white women who were abolitionists were at the same time not including black women as a part of the suffragist movement. So it's interesting to see when, or to Paula Giddings, when and where I enter, how black folks were invited in and how they were excluded. So the Colored Women's Voter League emerged in response to being shut out of the suffragist movements by white women. So early 20th century, we have the Harlem Renaissance. And one of the things that happened during this explosion of artists and writers was a pushing back against black respectability politics from the earlier period. And that was through the arts. So you had folks like Josephine Baker. Here she is in the famous, or some would say infamous, banana skirt and the classic crossing of her eyes. Josephine Baker, as you know, goes off to Paris and becomes a celebrity there, but then comes back to the United States and is a part of the civil rights movement. Bruce Nugent, Black queer writer, becomes famous for his short piece, Smoke Lily's Jade. Moms Mabley. Not a lot of people know that Moms Mabley was queer, and started out as a vaudeville performer, and as she got older and was out of F's to give, her stand-up became more raunchy, and she lived quite a long time into her 90s. There's another performer that not a lot of people know about, Gladys Bentley, who was, in today's parlance, would be known as a drag king, who cross-dressed quite a bit in the 1930s, 1940s. One of my former students, Courtney Ziegler, in his dissertation has a chapter on Gladys Bentley and talks about Bentley's reversion to Black respectability politics in the 1960s, sheds her masculine identity and becomes domesticated. And he does this wonderful reading of Bentley's appearance in Ebony magazine, with her, in the kitchen cooking and so on and so forth. And yet there's this one picture of Bentley sitting in a chair with a book open with a picture of her performing in this this picture of her performing. So it's really fascinating. Nella Larson, a famous writer during this time, who was pushing the arts, pushing against propriety through her literature, and many of you may have seen the adaptation of her novel, Passing. I didn't care too much for the film, but it was a little snore fest a little bit. I'm like, y'all could have done a little more with it. Anyway, Passing has a homoerotic subtext between these two women. And again, that was revolutionary during this time. Then of course, Langston Hughes, and has several poems, Cafe 3 AM, and others about homosexuality. And of course, the Renaissance woman, Miss Zora Neale Hurston, who is, you could spend a whole year just talking about her and her fierceness. And Bessie Smith. There were a lot of blues and jazz singers of this time who were also pushing the envelope around sexuality and particular same-sex desire. And I wanted to pause here to share a little clip of this song by Bessie Smith, Prove It On Me Blues, which is about same-sex desire. Let's see if I can... This is 1928.
Went out last night, had a great big fight. Everything seems to go wrong. I looked up to my surprise. The gal I was with was gone. As she went, I don't know. I mean to follow everywhere she goes. Folks said I'm crooked. I didn't know where she took it. I want the whole world to know. These say I do it. Ain't nobody caught me. Sure got to prove it on me. Went out last night with a crowd of my friends. There must be women, 'cause I don't like no men. It's true I wear a collar and a tie. Make the wind blow all the while. But to say I do it, ain't nobody caught me. They sure got to prove it on me. So I love playing that song because, again, it's coded and not coded. I mean, there are parts of it that are ambivalent, but there are some words that are not, some lines that aren't. So that when sometimes queer theorists, particularly whose historians, are accused of being anachronistic because of how they're reading queerness into something. But then you have evidence that actually bolsters how they're making the argument. And I think this is a classic example of how Smith herself is giving you the evidence. You're not even having to make the argument. And what's also interesting, as I said before, this is in 1928. Again, going back to the governor who shall not be named, you can't talk about Black history without talking about the blues, and you can't talk about the blues without talking about sexuality. So if he had any educational value, he would know that. So moving along, the 1940s and 1950s, of course, we have World War II happening, and a lot of folks are being drafted into the war, including Black men, not so much Black women. But there is still a lot of cultural production going on, particularly writers like Gwendolyn Brooks, based in Chicago. She publishes Maud Martha, her novel Maud Martha, in around 1950. And a book like Maud Martha really is indicative of Black women's independence in the shadow of the post-World War II moment. Because if you can imagine, as white men are being drafted into the war and white women are being left alone, it's Black women who are becoming domestic workers to help these white women raise their families. And then after the war, there's another transformation with white men trying to take control of the household that they had lost control of. And so you see a proliferation of television shows like Father Knows Best,
Leave It to Beaver, that try to reestablish white patriarchy. So all of these things are going on around the same time. And the other thing that's going on in response to that is the second wave of feminism. So Simone de Beauvoir publishes The Second Sex, which is the first book to theorize gender as separate from sex. This is in 1949. Betty Friedan publishes The Feminine Mystique. Again, also part of this launch of the second wave of feminism. Because one of the things that Friedan's book did was critique the trope of woman as naturally dedicated to the domestic space. And that's a great critique, but again, it's pertaining to white women. Because as I just said, who was in the domestic space during the war? Black women. So a book like The Feminine Mystique, yes, is important to white women as defining or critiquing the notion that women are categorically confined to the domestic space, but it leaves out a race element and it leaves out a class element, because if you don't have any other option but to be in a domestic space, then where does that leave you? So all of these things are intertwined. Talked about that. In general, this decade between the 1950s and 1960s is the age of sexual freedom and reproductive rights. In 1965, I'll just put all these up. So in 1965, we have Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a senator at the time, who publishes The Negro Family, The Case for National Action, which becomes infamously known as the Moynihan Report, which demonizes black women as emasculators, suggests that black men's best chance of survival is to join the military so that they can be around other men to model how to be a man. We have the Equal Rights Amendment, or known as ERA, which never passed, almost, but didn't pass. And the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. So all of this is going on at the same time. And even though we have all these movements going on, black women are still being marginalized, even within civil rights and black power movements. And despite the fact that they're at the forefront of many of these movements. And so this is where black feminist voices within the movements begin to emerge. So we have Elaine Brown, who's a singer. Not a lot of people know that Elaine Brown was a singer, but she was the only woman to run the Black Power movement. Miss Angela Davis, has she been here yet? Has she been to Duke? Yeah. No? Yeah. She needs no introduction. Everyone knows how important Angela was. Pauli Murray, very important. Jane Crow, scholar, legal scholar, queer, and she was a part of the National Organization of Women, and also has ties to North Carolina. And then you also had, again, more artists. Nikki Giovanni, poet who just retired. One of the things, and it's interesting to me to, because anybody who knows Nikki Giovanni knows that she's not a shrinking violet, and that she speaks her truth. But the one thing that she has never discussed is her now over 30-something year, no, 40 relationship with her wife. She does not talk about her queerness, neither does Angela Davis. So it's real, and I'm not outing people, it's sort of like the open secret, but it's interesting to me how folks prioritize certain parts of their identity and not others. Despite that, Nikki Giovanni is a very important Black feminist voice artist during this moment. Lorraine Hansberry, also identified as bisexual, very important artist, activist, died much too young. Miss Sonia Sanchez, amazing. If you ever get a chance to meet her too, yeah, she is, and a trip. A lot of fun. Also had the emergence of Black gay voices. Again, you could spend a whole year on James Baldwin through his writing, and he was very explicit about the role that sexuality played in Black struggle. Although it's complicated, Sometimes he talked about sexuality, sometimes he didn't. But in his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, the young John, who's basically him, struggling with his sexuality. In Another Country, it's much more explicit. There's a gay character, Giovanni's Room, and by the time we get to his last novel, the main character is explicitly gay. Samuel Delany, another Black gay writer, mostly in the science fiction space, but using allegory to deal with sexuality. 1970, this is a watershed moment, the publication of The Black Woman by Toni Cade Bambara, because this is the first anthology to focus on African American women. So it's a very, very important text and a very important moment, because it also marks the beginning of women of color feminism. And you get to see that Black women start to build coalitions with Latina women, with Asian women, particularly in the context of a now very codified white feminist movement. So you have women of color going to these conferences and feeling marginalized because the things that they aren't, that folks are talking about at the National Organization of Women or these other feminist conferences don't pertain to their experiences, their lived experiences. It ain't so different from the suffragists just a few decades before. So this is a very important book. And then they just start coming. This Bridge Called My Back. All the women are white, all the blacks are men, but some of us are brave. And of course, we can't forget Michelle Wallace's Black Macho and the Myth of Superwoman. All of these anthologies and important texts start to emerge, and along with Alice Walker's In Search of My Mother's Garden. So it's a critical moment for women of color, feminism, and also lesbian of color feminism. That's a very important part to note. We also have Ntozake Shange's, let me go back. Ntozake Shange's For Colored Girls, which appears on Broadway in 1976. And so women of color are really doing their thing. The other thing that's important to note during this time, and again, this is the period between 1970s and the early 80s, Black feminist critics began to really push Black studies scholars to consider sexuality as a category of analysis. And one of the key articles that appeared during this time was Barbara Smith's Toward a Black Feminist Criticism. And that essay is really important because it ruffled a lot of feathers, including Toni Morrison. Because Smith argues that Sula, which hadn't been out that long, is a lesbian text. She reads the relationship between Nell and Sula as a lesbian relationship. But importantly, she reads it as a lesbian text, not in purely sexual terms, but in terms of friendship, female friendships. And so this is sort of the beginning of how we begin to think of queer as a term. Moving away from essentialist readings of sexuality that is not solely about behavior, but about, as my grandmother would say, being queer, strange, odd, different. So it's really trying to being more capacious about how we think about sexuality as in terms other than the act of sex. But Miss Morrison was not happy about that reading, and she would continue not to be happy about other people who will have certain things to say about her work, but you know, that was her journey. 1980s, very important part of what is going to become Black queer studies. The Black gay men who were a part of this Renaissance, importantly, were students, mentees of all those Black women, lesbian women who came before them. So a lot of people don't know that Marlon Riggs was a student at Berkeley, was very close to Barbara Christian, which led to all of his wonderful documentaries that weren't solely about sexuality. You know, Black is, Black ain't, Ethnic Notions, all of these wonderful films about Black folks. The Bay Area was like on and popping. But a lot of these gay men were in conversation with you know, people like Gloria Anzaldúa and Sheree Moraga and so on and so forth. And they created their own Renaissance in the 80s. So Marlon Riggs and Essex Hemphill were really good friends, collaborated on a number of anthologies. Some of their work I felt like saved my life as a person coming into my sexuality in the 80s, you know, finding their poems. Tongues Untied, which came out in 1989, which created a stir here in North Carolina. Point of View, which is a program on, POV, program on public, what is it called? PBS. Jesse Helms. I don't know, some of y'all too young to remember Jesse Helms. I remember him loud and clear. Such an a-hole. Anyway, he banned certain things from, kept certain things from being aired on PBS because he was on the Appropriations Committee in Congress, which pulled the funding. So Tongues Untied was one of the things that they banned. Asato Saint, Caribbean heritage. That's the other thing. the Black diaspora was also key to this movement. It wasn't just about Blacks in the United States, but Black folks from Jamaica, from Trinidad, from Puerto Rico, were all a part of a growing Black diasporic queer movement. And Assata Saint edited this anthology called Other Countries that was really important. There you see it there. We're coming home. The 1990s begins the formation of what we now know as Black queer studies. All of these things are happening. There's a cultural turn in the academy. What do I mean by cultural turn? Scholars begin to take into consideration in their analysis how folks are negotiating identity. There was a big backlash against theory with a capital T in the academy, particularly in English departments, because literature was literature with a capital L, and you're supposed to study the text and not pay attention to who wrote it. As more and more scholars of color were hired in the academy, they were like, no, you can't talk about Gwendolyn Brooks' poem without talking about the fact she was a Black woman from Chicago. So the analysis of these texts, but analyses in general, took into account history, took into account identity. So there was a cultural turn in the academy that also coincided with a postmodern critique of identity. So at the very moment that scholars of color are arguing that we must take identity into consideration, there was also a parallel movement to dismantle identity as a category of analysis. And those two things, and I would argue to this day, exist alongside each other. We also saw the emergence of gay and lesbian studies, not queer studies, not LGBTQ studies, but lesbian and gay studies. And that's a whole other class about, the nomenclature. The critiques came hard and fast. Evelyn Hammonds, in particular, published a wonderful essay called Black Holes, which is a critique of gay and lesbian studies. Because one of the things that happened is there's a whole proliferation of anthologies, gay and lesbian anthologies. And as with prior years, if there's a person of color in there, is one, and it's sort of the token essay or token author. And Evelyn Hammonds begins her Black Holes essay with talking about being invited to contribute an essay to the Gay and Lesbian Studies Reader, edited by, am I gonna remember their names? Abe Love, Barali, Michelle Barali, who was a colleague of mine at Amherst, and who was the third person? Anyway, it was three white folks. And so she begins that essay talking about the invitation to be a token. She's like, nope, not today. So anyway, all of this is happening in the 1990s. And then we have our first conference, Black Nations, Queer Nations in 1995. This is the first conference to focus on Black sexuality. And what's important about this conference is it's not an academic conference. These are activists. Scholars are there, but they are not the main focus. And it is documented. Shari Freelote, who's a documentary filmmaker, I think she's still at Sundance. She documented the Black nations, queer nations. We also see the emergence of queer of color critique with Jose Munoz's book, Disidentifications, and my good friend, Rod Ferguson's Aberrations in Black, toward a queer of color critique. And what's really important about these two texts is that they're drawing on women of color feminism. One of the things that come together in these books in particular is they do a wonderful job of talking about identity and also talking about why we can't essentialize identity. So they do a wonderful job of navigating that tension between identity as a category and identity as something performed, created. The other important thing that happens in 2000 that I was a part of is the Black Queer Studies in the Millennium Conference that happened at Chapel Hill, April 4th in 2000. I cannot believe it. It was a watershed moment, just like the Black Nations, Queer Nations conference was, because it was the first academic conference to focus on Black queer studies. And it was codified in this anthology published by Duke University Press. And many people don't know, but that's me on the cover when I had muscles. I did have them, I swear I did. It was a long time ago, but I did have them. This image was taken by a classmate of mine at Chapel Hill, a white Canadian actually, in Australia, because he immigrated to Australia after we graduated from Chapel Hill. His name is Spencer Houston. And for the conference, my good friend Cedric Brown, who's actually here this weekend because we're performing tomorrow and Sunday in a performance of oral histories on queer alums of Carolina, he took the image, inverted it so it looks like I'm praying, and then added this little, you know how a television, a black and white television look when there's just snow? He added that sort of touch to the top. It was a beautiful poster, and I don't have a copy of it to this day. I know people who do that won't give it to me, but so I know where to get one, but I don't have a copy of the poster. But anyway, this anthology is the first. I'm really happy to be a part of it. The first anthology to codify Black queer studies as a subfield of Black studies. Then we have the 2010s. We have Sharon Holland's The Erotic Life of Racism, have C. Riley Snorton's Black on Both Sides, focusing on trans history. That's me again. Someone said, when you gonna stop being on your books? I said, when they stop asking me. And I'm looking forward to the conversation because I'm at the end here. One of the things that came soon after Black Queer Studies, a critical anthology, is the critiques, because you know everybody loves to critique. And one of the critiques of the anthology was that there were no trans voices there, and it was still a little, for some, male-centric. So one of the wonderful things about getting older is watching how the young folks just take up the mantle and run with it. So during Black Queer Studies in the Millennium Conference, there were a lot of graduate students from around the country who didn't have no money, but they came and they pooled their resources together, and they were like 4 to 5 in a hotel room and so forth. And many of them were sleeping on my living room floor in my apartment. I lived off of 54, where 54 and 55 come together in an apartment complex called Waterford Village. I don't know if it's still there. But I had at least 4 or 5 bodies on my living room floor. Those same graduate students were in this anthology because they picked up the mantle and they pushed the field even further. So I said, we need an update. What's going on in the field now? So one of the things that that was really important to me was, where does the trans voice, the Black trans voice, fit within Black queer studies? Because there's tension there. There's tension between Black feminism and Black trans studies. There's tension between Black trans studies and Black queer studies. And so Kai Green, who goes by Marshall now, is the other person on this cover. And we're doing the most in this. But we are signifying on Robert Mapplethorpe, for one. But the other thing is, it's very subtle. You can see Kai's scar from his top surgery. So there are a lot of subtle things going on here, but it really is sort of the mother, me, looking over the shoulder of the next generation, and I've passed the tea cup to the next generation. There were other conferences that followed. In 2013, Black Sexual Economies conference held at Wash U. This anthology, which appeared in 2019, was the result of that. And that is it. So that's why Black Queer Studies matters. Because it's a part of our history. It's a part of the way in which we think about race, class, gender, ableism, so on and so forth. But again, it could not have happened without Black women. They were there from the start. So I'll stop there and open it up for conversation, questions, critiques.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really awesome. I'm curious to know, starting with Sojourner Truth and starting with Ain't I a Woman and activism and organizing, I'm curious to know your take on just current mobilizations today and how they are continuing to influence Black queer studies. I feel like you kind of alluded to it, but I wanted a little bit more than just an appetizer of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is really interesting to me is the hashtag Black Lives Movement, Black Lives Matter movement, started by queer people, queer women. And I don't think that's a coincidence, given, again, this history that I just laid out. I don't think that you can have the theory without the practice, and you can't have the practice without the theory. And so what's interesting to me is to see how these strategies of resistance have been informed over time through these theories, and how these theories have been informed by on-the-ground strategies through people's ethnographic research, but by folks being on the front line of of a march where you're you're pepper sprayed, or, you know, and then folks writing about it or creating a performance about it. I had the pleasure of interviewing Patrice Cullors. It was before the pandemic, so it must have been like 2017 or 2018. And one of the things that was interesting that she said is, because she was thinking about coming back to school to get a PhD in performance studies. I'm like, come on, come on, come on. But she said that before they started the Black Lives Matter movement, they were doing performances around, particularly her brother who had been incarcerated. She collected phone calls between her brother and her mother, when him calling from the police department, incorporated that into a performance that she staged outside the police station. So again, that's performance theory being put into practice through activism. And so I think all of the things that happened post George Floyd, for instance, that I saw were young folk using some of these strategies, but also being informed by what they had been reading in Black Studies classes, that I think is absolutely germane to our continued fight for freedom. Because as y'all probably heard from Ronaldo Walcott, we ain't free, we emancipated, but we ain't free. So I think that it's important to keep that in mind. The other thing though, and that's why I think charting out histories like this is so important, is to let folks know that no, you didn't invent this. Folks been out here in these freedom streets a long time. You may have a different spin on it, but the tactic is not brand new. And it's important that people pay tribute to the ancestors for what they've done, so that we could sit in places like Duke and have conversation about Black queer studies, because that is a privilege, not a right.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes.
Thank you. Could you talk about the role of oral history in your own work? I'm very interested in oral history, and I'm also interested in history in general, right? But particularly the history of queers who lived during different time periods, right? Like, if we don't know what they went through, we won't know, right? So I'm really interested in you talking through how you come to oral history. You know, you've definitely inspired me to think more about oral history, but I'm just interested in hearing you talk about it as a practice, and also how you've incorporated it into your performance work as well.
Yeah. So I got into oral history research and scholarship when I was undergrad at Chapel Hill. And in my, was I a sophomore? I can't remember. I was young. I took a class from Della Pollock, who's since retired, who was teaching this class on performance in oral history. And the class was going to culminate into a performance that traveled. So it was, the book was Like a Family, the story of Southern cotton mills. And Jim Laludis, oh my God, why am I, Jacqueline, thank you, Jacqueline Dowd Hall, and there was one other editor of that book. It was an oral history that they did of Southern cotton mill workers, and we adapted those stories into a performance and took the performance back to those cotton mills and performed them for some people who were still alive. And that was really my entrance into oral history and performance. And what was really compelling about it as a method was what it did for the folks who told those stories in the first place. Because there's a certain kind of validation, yes, by people being asked to tell their story, and then there's yet another validation by having that story reflected back to them. And that became really fascinating to me, such that I, as you all know, go on to have my whole career defined by oral history work. But my first oral history was not of a queer person. It was my grandmother, who is the founder of the theory that, you know, that I've become most famous for, queer theory. And so that's why I say it's so important to understand the role that sexuality has in Black history, because sometimes it's not about, again, sexual practice. It's about a way of being in the world. So my dissertation is an oral history of my grandmother's life as a live-in domestic. So she was a live-in domestic from 1955 to 1973 in Hickory, North Carolina, and I analyzed her oral history as an instance of Black feminist theory. And that's how I really got into this notion of how the quotidian is also a form of theorizing. And I still believe that today. One of the people that I interviewed for Sweet Tea, for instance, who at the time identified as trans, Charles, there's a section of Charles's narrative where he says, why should I risk my life? Why should I risk losing my life on the surgeon's table to appease others? And would it really appease them? Like I said, I had to be comfortable within the skin that I was in, and knowing that a physical change wasn't going to change who I was mentally. It might soften the blow for you to say, well, shit, at least she looks like a natural woman now. She has a vagina, she has smooth skin and long flowing hair. But does that truly constitute being a woman? Or does a muscular physique truly constitute being a man? And the only one that can decide that is yourself. Who is that? Judith Butler. That's gender performativity, coming from someone who barely finished high school, who's theorizing gender. And so that is really fascinating to me and compelling. And I want to use this platform that I have to elevate those voices. And that's not any dig against Judith Butler. I mean, her theorizing revolutionized the academy, but it didn't revolutionize Hickory, North Carolina. Mm-hmm. So you got to study up and you got to study down. So that is why oral histories for me is so important, to have people share their stories, share their theories, and have people bear witness to those stories, because I think it's just really, really important.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your knowledge and your wisdom and how you're showing up in this space. My name is Ivy. I also went to UNC Chapel Hill for undergrad. And I'm going back for my library science degree in the fall. And I wanted to ask particularly around libraries and access, right, to information. What role do you see Black queer studies playing in terms of access to information, especially for folks who identify with that intersectionality and want to learn more about how to navigate that language in their discipline of interest, whether that be psychology or health sciences or literature, humanities, because I find that Black queer studies, just as integral as racial, like African American, African diaspora studies, is very integral to the perspective that we bring to the discipline of our focus. So, yeah.
It's funny that you asked that. So I was sharing that I'm a part of this performance this weekend. It's called The Story of Us. And I'm performing myself, which is really weird. And I'm like, did I really say that? But last night when we were doing the read-through, and I'm gonna get to your answer to your question. We were doing the read-through, and I was reading something and I was like, I know I didn't say this. And the word was citizens. And I know I said sissies. I know I said sissies. The person who did the script said, I will send you the link to your interview so that you can listen to it again. I share that story to say to you, archives matter, and that's where the library comes in. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who do this research to donate the data to archives. So the interviews from Sweet Tea are at the Southern Oral History Program at Chapel Hill. The ones I did for Honey Pot and Black Queer Southern Women are there as well. Because I think, after I'm long gone, people will want to, and even now, people will want access to these stories. And I think the way that they have archived them across a number of categories. So if you want to focus on the South, or if you want to focus on gayness, or if you want to focus on working classes, if you want to focus on a particular part of North Carolina, the cross section of those identities, the library, the archive, help shape that for scholars and researchers. And I also think it's important that universities, and they are doing a better job at this, provide access to books electronically, because that ship has sailed, and so everybody can't afford a book to buy it, and so online access I think is really important for libraries. I also think, we have a new dean of the library at Northwestern. He's forward thinking because he wants to transform the library into a different kind of space, because people aren't going to the library to check out a book when you can do it online. So he's trying to think of ways in which the library can become a gathering space for collaboration, for experimentation, and that's thinking outside the box, because the library isn't what it used to be. Now, when I was here, it was so funny when we were doing the read-through last night. Now, remember these were queer people in the 60s and 70s, so they were doing the best they could. But the library was a place for shenanigans. There were so many bathroom stall stories. I was like, really? That was going on when I was in the library, Wilson Library. Shenanigans. But we want to transform the library into a space that is, in addition to going to check out a book, but archives are really, really important. Yeah.
Hi. Okay. So I had like two people in my ear as I was listening to your talk. One was Cheryl Clark and the failure to transform in particular. And then the other is Rod in the back of my mind being like, but what about institutionality? What about power? So I'm going to try to ask a question that does justice to Rod if he's listening. And so on the failure to transform of it all, I'm thinking about how part of this talk, and particularly Barbara Smith's essay, Toward a Black Feminist Criticism, and its institutional life, it's a story of transformation. Like I think about not only Toni Morrison, but that essay that Deb McDowell wrote in the 80s. only to then become, right, maybe that token in the ABLA volume, and to, to do that work making connections on lesbian desire in passing. So I think about, like, that is one instance, but, like, the story you're telling as a long story of Black queerness and queer studies capacity to do some real transformative work, particularly around and inside the academy, in addition to activism. Then I'm thinking about, Rod, what about institutionality? What about power? And I'm thinking about the moment that we're in now with regard to the way that folks of your generation, right, have now passed through, tenured. Some of you are deans, some of you are presidents of universities, who have been through, or of the Ford Foundation, and like, some of you have engaged with labor disputes and, like all that kind of thing. And so I think in light of the kind of moment that both in some ways Black queer studies, but certainly some of the people who, right, have carried that forward in the institution now have a measure of power. I wonder how you're thinking about the work, both that maybe Black queer studies, the way that it's failed to transform, right, the place that it's passing through, but also lately, from where you are, what your hopes are for what Black queer studies can do to kind of transform the institutions of the academy, given what's going on. So I hope that makes sense.
No,
as a question.
it does. The first thing I'll say is Black folks' relationship to power is always nebulous. I have lots of power as a dean to a certain point. What I've been able to do institutionally has been transformative for certain people. Because I bring all of who I am, including my, project self, project living self, single family self, son and grandson of domestic worker self, to these academic streets, my orientation toward other folk is different than other people who are in these positions. So when I see the folks who clean these spaces, I'm going to acknowledge them. I'm going to see them. When I see the folks who serve the food at these fancy receptions, that's my orientation. And as dean, I also have the power to focus on their salaries and so on and so forth. That does not mean that I'm not in cahoots, as it were, with who I report to, because they control certain things that I don't control. So you're always, to draw on Jose Munoz, you're always disidentifying. You're working against and you're also working within these systems of power. And it really heartens my soul to see some of us moving into these spaces because it matters. It also saddens me to know that we have to experience some of the things that some of my friends have had to experience, and of no fault of our own. If you think about someone like Dwight McBride, president of the New School, who negotiated with the unions, and he himself is pro-union, but as a president of a school that's founded on socialism, it ain't got no endowment. So that kind of tension is always going to be there, and it can take its toll on folks. So and I said no to this job twice because I knew it was going to be hard. I know it's going to be as hard as it ended up being because I became dean at the height of COVID. August 1st, 2020 is when I started this job. So I think it's important, again, to bring your full self to these positions and to be guided by a set of ethics. No matter what the circumstances, and just be true to that. Institutions do change, but that change is very slow, and there's going to be setbacks. I'm thinking, it's 2023, you would think it's 1953, given the cultural wars that are going on right now. We're banning books, really? In 2023, we're banning books? We can't say the word gay? We can't show children a picture of the Statue of David? So it's a real tricky negotiation. I interviewed with Mark Anthony Neal for Left of Black, and I was talking about how I'm planning my exit strategy. I feel like, if I do nothing else today, if I were to keel over today, I've done some things, and I don't think that I don't have more things to do, but if I don't do anything else, I've done some work that folks can build on and pick up the mantle again towards that journey toward freedom. And I think it's important that those of us who are in these roles are checked from time to time, because you can get caught up. And I think that's healthy. I think where it's unhealthy is when people try to destroy you. Because when I see my friends get death threats, when they actually don't control the institution, they might be head of it, but they don't control it, that's a line too far. And so, yes, we're going to be, as Rod argues, institutions appropriate our movements. They do. But just like Black folks have been doing since we landed here and before, we find new ways. We find new avenues to get around those things. So that's a long, non-committal answer to your question, but it's a question that is really complicated, and that I'm actually living through at this moment. But I'll end by saying, I didn't want the job, but I think it's important that I'm in it.
I also use oral histories and archival materials in my performance work, and I like to think of the body as an archive.
Absolutely.
But of course it's incomplete, and there's hidden memories and stories. But I think oral history is I think of it like a methodology, right? Alongside movement of the body, and also because of lack of documentation and preservation historically, so we built an archive. So I was curious if you position the body in a way like that, or kind of a different perspective.
Yeah, I position my own body because I embody the people that I interview. And so it's through my performance work that I put these stories in my body to learn from them, to know from them, and provide an opportunity to see, for them to have their world reflected back to them. And just as I was responding to Nikki's question with quoting Charles, like, that's in my body, that I can just sit here and say, this is what Charles said. And that's verbatim because Charles has been a part of my repertoire for so long. And it's not just about memorizing someone's oral history, it's about getting to know them in an intimate way such that you are changed by their story. And that kind of embodiment, I think, is something that could be helpful to those who disagree with you, who other you, because those of us in performance studies think as performance as a way of knowing the other. And it's something that I practice. And it's not a panacea for everything, no, and there are pitfalls to it, but the attempt to understand the other through performance, I think, is a profound methodology.
Thank you again for this. This is just so wonderful. I'm curious, as someone who has centered his own story throughout a number of your works and your performances, I'm curious about what you think about E. Patrick Johnson, your story, E. Patrick Johnson, the scholar, the performer, the critic. How do all of those three forms of you sort of interact with each other?
They fight all the time. They are knocking each other out, rolling around on the ground. I'm actually not lying. They do. I don't necessarily separate them out like that, because I think the performer is also a critic. And I think the critic is definitely a performer. And an administrator, and all the things. Just as I was saying earlier in my lecture, how I don't think you can have theory without practice and practice without theory. I feel the same way, and I try to embody that in the way I move in the world. I think the thing, and no one believes this, I don't even think Jasmine would believe this. At heart, I'm a recluse. I know. I love being alone. And that's different from being lonely. I love my alone time, and I think, Lamont, the reason why that is the case is I give so much all the time that when I have that space to just be quiet and just rejuvenate, it's so precious, and I just love it. And and as a kid, I was really, really shy. You know, my mother is the one that was trying to push me on stage. I think I told this story to Mark too. When I was a kid, you know, I love to sing, but I like to sing for other people. I just like to sing. But my mother was always putting me in these talent shows, and I had stage fright. I had really bad stage fright. And half the time I wouldn't even go. And I think it's because ultimately I like being alone. So I would say there is a E. Patrick that I reserve for me, that you all don't see. And I don't mean that this is fake. That's not what I'm suggesting, but I'm suggesting that, and then maybe I would argue this for everyone. Everyone needs a space to be in themselves in a quiet space, to reflect, to rejuvenate, to not be beholden to others to do anything, but be yourself, whatever that is at the moment. So yeah, so I would say that's the only thing that's sort of separate from, you know, the critic, the performer, and what was the third one you said?
The scholar.
The scholar, yeah. Yeah, I would say the E. Patrick Johnson that is sort of my authentic self, whatever that means, that doesn't have anything to do with an other, including my husband. That's the thing that's separate, and I think it's important.
Well, we will conclude our final masterclass for the semester, and again, a huge thank you to
It was my pleasure. Thank you all.